Anyone having business before the King's Justice of the Superior Court of Justice shall be heard. Long live the King.
Morning all.
Good morning. Good morning, Professor Mintz.
Good morning.
Just to telegraph where I'm going, my intention is to assess whether or not after through the lunch hour, whether I will be able to complete the examination, the cross-examination today. And so I'll probably have a better estimate for the court after lunch.
And I should say that the reason I was so adamant in telling you you had time
Yeah,
was because I don't want to feel that I can't ask questions from time to time.
yes, indeed. And look, at the best time for the court to ask questions is as soon as the court has questions to ask. And I do not want the court to not interrupt the flow if the court has a question, because I think it's more important for you to get your questions answered than for me to guess what questions I think you need to have
Okay.
answered.
Thank you.
So let's operate under that paradigm. The second thing is just housekeeping. There's three exhibits that I'm going to be referring to today that weren't included in my compendium that I thought might be useful to ask some questions about. It's exhibit 5, an excerpt of exhibit 5, which is part of the slide deck from Professor Stiglitz, and copies of exhibit 1-006 and 1-0047, which I have provided to all my friends and to the court and to the witness, and we'll get to it. And I'll
Okay, and exhibit 5 was,
the trial demonstratives of Professor Joseph Stiglitz.
okay, thank you.
Yes, and it's on the bottom left-hand side, it says what it is. And on the top right.
Oh, I see, thank you.
Yes, and the top right-hand side, Ms. Lewis just identified it as an excerpt of exhibit 5.
Right, thank you.
And so if I may proceed, I will proceed with witness. Yes.
Let's go ahead.
Professor Mintz, yesterday you gave evidence about economic rents and how they're determined in principle. And you might remember on your slide deck at page 9, you gave an explanation. Did you watch or listen to the testimony of Professor Joseph Stiglitz in this case?
I didn't watch, but I did read the testimony and I looked at his demonstrative slides.
Okay. And so I'd like you to just take a look at his demonstratives, the excerpt from exhibit 5. There are 2 slides here, and under the heading, the value of the RST Anishinaabeg's contribution, and he used an example of a gold mine. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that Joseph Stiglitz's explanation of economic rents is another way of explaining how economic rents are determined?
I would say it's consistent because the important assumption he makes is the assumption about competitive markets for labor, capital, and suppliers.
Yes.
And in a sense, I was assuming that as well. And
Yes.
except with respect to the management issue, which I'm not sure is captured here or not.
Well, that management issue, wouldn't you agree would be captured in either investors or labor or suppliers capturing a portion of the rents?
Well, he was saying, higher prices for, let's say, goods and services or wages and salaries. He's assuming labor is compensated by only wages and salaries. In the case of an operator company that comes in, the usual kind of relationship is more of a profit sharing.
Okay, so
which is different than wages and salary.
Okay, so aside from the comment about that you've just given that one caveat, you would agree that his explanation and his bar charts are correct in respect of a way to look at how rents or economic rents are to be understood.
Yeah, well, I think that the difference is that we agree on the basic point that there's economic rent. The question is, who does the economic rent go to?
Oh, undoubtedly, but
Okay.
this is just his, Professor Stiglitz's excerpts, pages 21 and 22 of his trial demonstratives are just another way of showing what you showed at page 9
Yep.
of your slide deck. Is that correct?
I think that's correct.
Thank you. Now, yesterday, you talked about having read a report from Dr. Gwyn Jones, I believe it is.
The annuity report,
Well, you called it the annuity report, and
I
I
just
think
sort of remember the title.
you called it the annuity report, but your lawyer stood up and said it was a Gwyn Jones report. And I encourage counsel to stand up and correct me if I'm wrong about that.
I don't think Gwyn Jones is a doctor.
Oh,
first of all.
okay.
You had asked me, you turned to me and asked me what annuities report Professor Mintz was referring to, and I said, I believe it's the Gwyn Jones report, because we did provide Professor Mintz with the stage 1 report prepared by Ms. Jones.
Okay. Do you remember receiving a stage 1 report from your counsel?
I didn't know it was stage 1 necessarily, but it was a report that I read.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you read a report and you seem to, and your counsel has said it's Gwyn Jones. Do you remember it being Gwyn Jones as you sit here today? And you remember reading it?
I read it, but it was quite a while ago.
Okay, and I noticed that Gwyn Jones's report is not listed in your instructions. You would agree with that?
That probably is correct, but
Well, we can take a look if you like. Do you want to take a
I
look?
think the instructions didn't include it, but I
Okay.
was sent it and I read it.
How did it come to be that you were given a copy of Gwyn Jones's report?
It was sent to me by counsel.
Did you ask for it?
No,
Did you receive instructions to look at it?
it was sent to me to read.
Was it sent by email?
No, it was sent by paper.
Was there a cover letter asking you to look into her report?
It was just very early stage. I was given also the, I guess the judgment and the decisions, I think is the right appropriate wording. And there was that report, and I think that was about, I don't know if there was anything else. I
But
don't remember.
I'm just wondering if the reports that you were given came with instructions that aren't included in your instruction letter that is attached to your report. Is that possible?
No.
So
At least I don't recall.
you don't recall?
There may have been, I don't know if there was an email or anything like that. I don't remember.
Can we turn to paragraph 12 of your main report, which is exhibit 29, determining the value of net resource revenues in the Robinson Treaty Territories?
Sorry, sorry, where again?
Paragraph 9, it's at page 9 of exhibit 29.
Okay, sorry.
It's the larger of your two reports.
Yeah, so you want paragraph,
Paragraph 12, if you
Yes,
could go to
okay,
paragraph
I have it.
12, it's
I have
the
it.
first couple words are,
I just want
Nat-
to make sure I have the right paragraph.
yeah, we don't want you to have the wrong one. Natural resource revenues are levies. That's the paragraph we're asking you to look at. And at paragraph 12, you make the point that natural resource revenues could include royalties, land lease payments, and profit sharing. You see that at paragraph 12?
Mhm.
You have to answer yes for the record.
Yes.
Okay, thank
Sorry.
you. Now, I want to talk firstly about land lease payments. So land lease payments, am I correct in understanding, could include the right to use lands like an easement Do you know what an easement is?
Uh, sort of, but yes, including, you know, it's going a little bit beyond my competence right now, but.
Okay, so I'll stay away from the
I
legal
know there's a lease-
technological
There's a
term.
lease
So
that
I-
has. There's a lease that has, you know, certain conditions attached to it, but, you know. In fact, in a way, this, when Justice Kennedy, you asked me, you know, about the principal agent problem. I forgot to mention that actually the lease is like a contract between the government and the private producer at that point, when they have the right to access, the right to exploit.
And so when you talk about land lease payments, it could extend to an agreement to allow someone to use land, not just to rent the land, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so one of the ways, and I used an easement is the right given to, you can use this as an operative explanation, the right to put things on someone's land or to go across someone's land.
I believe so, yes.
Would those be the kinds of land lease payments you're thinking about?
Well, in, you know, the ones I know best, is in the oil and gas sector, is that, when a company acquires a lease, it has the right to explore, for a mineral deposit.
When a company has a pipeline and it goes through an Indian reserve, they would get something called a right of way.
I believe so. Again, it's something I'm not particularly familiar with.
But when we talk about a permission to cross someone's land, would that be included as part of the land lease payments? In your understanding of what a land lease is?
I have to admit, I don't know. You know,
Okay.
you're asking me questions that, these are getting into legal issues that
Okay.
I'm not necessarily familiar with in terms of all lease contracts.
Would you, maybe I can rephrase it this way. If there's a bargain where the owner of land allows someone else to use land that they own, that would fit into the land lease payment?
My understanding, yes.
Okay. Let's turn to, you also said that it can include in profit sharing. Can you explain to me how profit sharing for the Crown could be part of resource revenues? I'm not sure what you mean there. I need some help.
Well, it's really the, sharing of the profits from the project in some sort of, payment system.
And that could be as in Norway, when the government insists, insists that there's a contract for sharing of profits.
Well, I won't, well, I won't, you know, Norway is a little more complicated because the two major oil companies are owned by the government. So I don't, you know, I'm not sure whether Norway is the example I want to talk about, but I'm just simply saying that there is a lease that's given, and it's, and the ones that I know particularly in Canada is through an auction process. And it gives the right to a company to exploit the land in order to extract mineral resources. And then there's terms and conditions associated with that lease, including a payment system where the government is given a royalty or some, you know, other type of terms of the government.
But
As a group.
profit sharing, as you understand it at paragraph 12, can be something more than just royalties. Is that right?
Yes, because there are profit-based royalties, and there's also income-based royalties, as in the case of mining in Ontario.
I wonder if we could turn then to paragraph 14 of your reply report. That's or your SIR reply report. Excuse
Okay.
me, it's the smaller of the two. At paragraph 14, and I think at this stage of your reply report, there's some talk about the joint venture approach to revenue sharing, and you and Mr. O'Riordan say, it is true, however, that part of our disagreement relates to the quantum of their results. In comparing the results of alternate approaches, if one approach produces a result that is exceedingly large, as their approach does and their result is, then as a sanity test, it begs the question as to whether their methodological approach is incorrect. And I think Professor Stiglitz had a similar sort of sanity test that he employed as well.
Mhm.
So I think we both understand it, but I want to discuss your comment about exceedingly large. That's what you say, if the result is exceedingly large, and that's a pejorative term, wouldn't you agree?
I would probably agree. It may be pejorative in that sense.
Yeah, because
depends what you
what's
mean by
large
exceedingly large.
depends.
Because it, in terms of how it's a qualitative, not a quantitative statement.
Yes, thank you, thank you. Now, the first point is this large result was it confined to your concern, or the concern about exceedingly large results? Was it confined to just the income disparity approach, or was it just a general comment?
I think if you remember. I think this had to do with the joint venture approach.
Okay, so it's a general comment about the joint venture approach.
Yes, if I recall.
And is it fair?
Although I will say that Mr. Reardon may probably give you a more concrete answer in terms of what was meant here. He was the primary author of that part. As I said, I was mainly discussing in the reply the part that I wrote.
Okay. Is it fair that your joint report that you wrote with Mr. O'Riordan that you take ownership of, which you've testified to that already, also included a concern about the quantum when you got down to income disparities as well, correct?
I think that's correct. Yes.
Okay. The first thing that I want to discuss in respect of exceedingly large is your analysis, as I read it. When I say your analysis, you and Mr. O'Riordan, proceeds on the basis that the award, whatever it is tax-free in the hands of the First Nations and tax-free in the hands of band members. Would you agree with that?
I don't remember using the word tax-free. It may have been used, but.
Well,
I don't remember.
the reason why I'm asking is because in your analysis, one of the concerns is that when you got to the income disparity approach, you said Stiglitz and Hutchins should have used the after-tax effect.
Well, that's correct.
So that tells me in my mind that you were taking, and that, sorry, let me pause. That's not a good question at all. Let me pause. One of the concerns that you raised in your report, as I read it, was that the Anishinaabe get money tax-free on reserve, and therefore the proper comparator is not pre-tax earnings, it's after-tax earnings, income. Is that right?
Well, I think it had to do with the disparity measurement. not that we're arguing that there isn't disparity, there is disparity. But one should take into account the fact that and that over the years, whether I'm not sure this is, I'm not sure, again, this goes beyond my competence when it comes to treaties and interpretation and things like that. But I do know under the income tax that First Nations living on reserves, not in urban centers, as I understand it, but on reserves, do not have to pay income taxes.
Right.
So that
And
if you're comparing the after tax, sorry, if you're comparing for disparity reasons, just in terms of the measurement, I'm not questioning that there isn't disparity, but if you're comparing the two, one should really be looking at the after tax incomes, given that non-Indigenous people do pay income tax. Well, Indigenous people do. Now, it turns out that, you know, for low income people, non-Indigenous people don't pay a lot of income taxes, we know. But that's, so the disparity actually the adjustment isn't too large in that sense. But this has nothing to do with, or at least I wouldn't say nothing to do, but certainly our discussion of that was not a matter of discussing the compensation that would be paid, whether it's tax-free or not. I didn't think about that at that point.
well, but in your report, you end up, I think this is an accurate summary, saying that the figures that Stiglitz and Hutchins used, instead of being 100% of their figures, it should be 69% of their
Correct.
figures, right?
That's correct. I remember that.
And that 69% was based on after so it was based on the theory that the Anishinaabe don't pay tax.
No, it also took into account, which actually was a bigger correction, of going from average to median, where median is a 50 percentile in comparing incomes. And because it turns out that when you're looking at average income, you end up looking at an income that's much higher than the 50 percentile. So in other words, we thought that at least disparity, one would like to first move to the median income level, not the average income level, to make the comparison. And then we made an argument that should be also after-tax income. And I think that's if I recall, there was a table in the report, and actually it's on page 89, paragraph 214. And you'll see a table that provides those calculations. We didn't have it specifically for the RST area, but this is for all of Ontario between Indigenous and non-Indigenous population. And as you can see, that average income is much higher than the median income for both cases. And that's because you tend to have some very wealthy people that tend to bring up the average, relative to what the median is. This is because of the way the distribution of incomes go in population. And if you look, the drop using after-tax income, there is a drop for both, not as big for the Indigenous population, because there are Indigenous people that don't live in reserves and do pay income tax. And the general population, there's an $7,000 drop when you look at median after-tax income that takes into account the income tax that's paid. And the Indigenous population is a drop of about $3,500. So that's all. So as you can see, it's actually the big drop is really going from average to median. So it's not just the after-tax.
All right.
situation.
I didn't say it was just the after-tax.
Well,
I
I'm
mean,
sorry,
I
I'm
apologize
sorry.
if I left you with that
I'm
impression.
sorry that I did get that impression from
Okay.
your question.
So part of it then is because of how you treat income tax.
Correct.
Part of this,
Part of your
Proposal.
calculation of the coming to the 69% of what Stiglitz and Hutchins arrived at was income tax treatment, right?
Yes, I believe we gave difference. anyway, I do remember the 69% number, so we're not arguing, we're not disagreeing on that.
Right.
But that was including both corrections, not just one.
Right, but am I correct in understanding that the correction for income tax presumes that all the First Nation members are on reserve?
No, our calculation is based on both the mix of those on reserve and those not on reserve. If it was, living in the urban areas and paying income tax. So when you look at that table, going back to it, obviously, when you bring in after-tax income, which is primarily the income tax, there is a drop in average income, which is reflective of the people that are living in the urban center. So it's actually, if we had a separation of reserves and non-reserve First Nations, then if the drop for those living on the reserve may not be as large as what's shown here.
The data you looked at, Professor Mintz, was not data from the RST treaty territory, was it?
That's what I said. It was Ontario-wide. It was illustrative.
It's just illustrative. It doesn't actually include in the actual condition of the Robinson Superior treaty bands and how much are on and how much are off reserve.
No, and we said that in our report,
And
that one would want to do further adjustments.
well, you would agree with me that in making an award, how much is actually left in anyone's pocket is important for the court to know, right?
Mhm.
Is that yes?
I would think so, yes.
And just so that we can perhaps square this circle, if you go to the compendium, volume 2, tab 20. That's exhibit L.2, volume 2, tab 20. What we have there is page 300, it's at page 704 of the compendium.
Yes,
And it is a part of Hutchins, part of the Stiglitz and Hutchins demonstratives at page 311. And so instead of 193.6 billion, you would say that the proper amount should be 69% of that, according to your calculations.
yeah. Well, you're assuming the 60-40 equity to debt blend.
Yes,
calculation, right?
yes, assuming, right.
Assuming that.
It would be 69%, and I've done the math. It's a little over 133 billion.
Yeah.
You would agree with that?
If you were using that number, yes.
Yes. And if you were using, and to be fair, if you were only using band trust rates, it would be 69% of 34.4 billion, which according to my math is around 23.7 billion.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you are aware that Professors Stiglitz and Hutchins did not deal with any relative deprivation for the period 1850 to 1870.
I believe so, yes.
Did you try and adjust for that?
No,
Do you have any idea what that relative deprivation would have been for those 20 years?
no idea.
Would you at least agree with me that not including any relative deprivation would be a conservative estimate? Would make Stiglitz and Hutchins erring on the conservative side?
I don't know. One would have to look at the data.
Let's take a look at paragraph 215 of your main report. At paragraph 215, you and Mr. O'Riordan postulate that perhaps the aim is to avoid poverty. You see that in the middle?
Yes,
Did you come up with that on your own, or did someone tell you to look at that issue?
We came up with it on our own in this following sense. I mean, it's not something that we just pulled from the air. It's a argument that, as we discussed in the report, that governments have been trying to make sure that people are not impoverished. Then the question is, how do you measure the poverty line? And Statistics Canada actually has three methods of measuring the poverty line. The one that we talk about is what's called the low income measure, which is 1/2 of the median income.
I wonder if you could, I mean, I don't want to limit your answers, but please just listen carefully to the question. But the question was, when you, or maybe I'll rephrase the question. Why did you decide that avoiding poverty might be a metric for compensation for this treaty bargain? This I don't understand.
Okay, it goes back to that even if you use the median income level and you bring up everybody to the median income level, people are still people at the median at 50% are still going to be better off than half the Ontario's population. And so then the question is, you want to go to 50% or some other level? The only reason we took the as illustrated really the low income measure is that I think at the very minimum is you want to try to have people who are not in poverty.
So maybe I can try and rephrase the question this way. I didn't see anything in the court judgments or the court reasons that talk about reducing poverty. Did you?
Well, they talked about depravity. I guess the question is, how do you define depravity and being depraved? And it's true, I didn't see anything in the court.
And would you agree with me?
On poverty, but it was a way of trying to understand or put into practice what we mean by being depraved. Because we have to remember there's a large number of non-Indigenous people that are below the poverty line too.
This case doesn't concern remedying that problem.
Oh, no, totally agree.
Thank you. As I understand the bargain that was reached in 1850, there wasn't a discussion about poverty at that time. You have no reason to disagree with me on that.
No, I don't disagree.
Okay, let's turn to paragraph 193. Go back a bit of your report, of your main report. There's a heading entitled Implications of Economic Rent and Shared Risk Approach on Per Capita Payments. Now, do you appreciate that the annuity is a collective entitlement for the First Nation bands?
If I recall, it's a payment to the band, but it was based on the population, if I recall. I mean, the annuity that was to be brought forward.
So your
On the number of people.
understanding and your analysis in your report is based on the treaty being a population-based treaty amount.
No, just that the treaty, the annuity that was supposed, and you can correct me on this, I may have it wrong. And but if I recall, the augmentation was based on would be a payment that would go to each that would be based on the number of people in the First Nation.
So what if I was to tell you that the annuity augmentation has nothing to do with the number of people? Would that change your opinion at all?
No, it wouldn't change. Not with respect to this analysis, no.
Why did you choose to do your calculation based on per capita payments? Was it simply because you thought all of it had to be paid out?
No, it's just and Mr. Reardon is probably better able to answer this because he did the calculations with respect to this part of the report. But it's based on the idea that, how do you compensate people? We weren't, as we made it very clear in the report, that the per capita, it was only a place to start in terms of equal per capita amounts paid in terms of shares. And so in the example we gave, 10% of the population was indigenous in the area, and roughly, and in fact, that's the numbers there. And if you had equal per capita payments to everybody, then 90% would go to the Crown, 10% would go to the First Nations. And that was, we started with that idea that everyone would get the same per capita amount. We're not saying that should be the final solution. In fact, we talk about that there may be an escalator that one would take into account things like depravity and other factors that would give a higher amount to the indigenous people. But we talked about that because there's actually some practice that we've seen where when things happen, people do use the per capita approach as a way of as a starting point.
Professor Mintz, you don't know how the First Nations would use this collective annuity amount when it came in, if and ever it came in, do you?
No.
At paragraph 193, you opined that a portfolio return of 60-40 equity and debt is inappropriate. See that?
Sorry, where is that again?
Paragraph 193.
Yes.
And you say it's inappropriate because it would result in extremely high augmentation of annuities.
The discount rate matters a huge amount. Yes.
Well, that's indeed true. So the problem is not the amount of the annuity augmentation in any year that makes the total large. It's the compounding over the years of non-payment. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And at paragraph 195, you then break down certain assumptions based on the 60-40, that what it would give to each individual on a per capita basis. You see that?
Yes.
And when you talk about, and let's go to, just as an example, at paragraph 196, you talk about even if the value of rents was at band trust rates, it would afford a payment of 1.7 million for each RST recipient. See that?
That's correct.
Now, where in your analysis do you, that's for each RST recipient who's alive today, right?
That's correct.
That doesn't take into account all the people that went before.
That's correct.
And it doesn't take into account that a lot of the reason why the number is so high is because of non-payment over the years.
That's correct.
Now, I'm going to suggest to you that if an individual, and I want to just go with the way that you looked at it on a per capita basis, and we'll argue that it's not the right way, but that's for lawyers to argue before judges. But I just want to work with this, whether 1.7 million per person is fair. You do appreciate that if we were only talking about the existing cohort, the 15,000 or so RST members. That 1.7 million would be a payment for a lifetime of not, up to now, of not receiving any payment. You appreciate that?
Yes, well, sorry, what do you mean by lifetime? Do you mean
Well,
lifetime of the community, which goes back
No, no, we're,
170 years, or lifetime of the person?
yeah, good question. It's the lifetime of the person. And let's
Okay.
use a 70-year-old elder
Mhm.
in the community who, after 70 years of not receiving an annuity, not receiving the benefit of that annuity, living in poverty for 70 years, and I'd like ask you to assume that he receives 1.7 million for that 70 years. That's not really that much per year, is it?
Oh, per year?
Yeah.
Well, let's see, yeah, if you divide by 70, yes,
Right, it's not much.
yeah, ton. But of course, yeah, no, it would be, I haven't figured it out, if you divide by 70, it would be a couple of 100,000 per year. I don't know, can I work that out?
Yeah, do you have a calculator? Because I don't.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, so why don't you take 1.7 million and divide it by 70 years?
Glad I brought my.
What's that?
phone. I usually leave my phone somewhere else.
Yeah,
I don't look at it, but
sure.
and we're dividing by 70,
Yep, just in our
yeah,
example.
so it'd be $24,285 per year.
That sounds
But that
pretty
includes
reasonable.
being a child, and
What's that?
that includes someone being, that's including being a child and not working during, when you're young, right?
Yes.
And there's. So 70 is a bit high, but
Right.
What did you say? 24, what, 5?
24. Of course, every time you close it, you have to,
$24,285 is what you
Right.
said.
but that was dividing by 70. Now, if
Yeah.
you think of somebody, usually we think of person working, like the employable numbers, years would be 16 to, whatever age. So if you took 16 years off, somewhat higher number, but, let's not quibble. about
Well, no, I don't
25
think,
and 30,000.
well,
Yeah.
it's an important point because a 15-year-old who might not be working might have a capital asset to invest. Does he get to earn any money from that capital asset? Like
You
we
might.
did,
Yeah, but it.
I'm sorry?
Are you saying if it's given at the age of 0?
Yes,
Yeah,
So-
that's a fair point.
yeah.
Yeah.
So suppose an Anishinaabe individual had a piece of land he owned. He wanted to put that piece of land to work.
Mhm.
He would profit from that, even though he isn't working yet.
Well, or his parents would, right?
Or his parents would have to hold it in trust, but.
Okay.
So
anyway,
we're in agreement with that.
Yeah.
So the age that you start working, if you have a capital asset, maybe isn't the best. Best analogy. Would you agree with that?
I guess so.
Now, depending on the circumstances, and let's talk about people having capital assets, and it's another way of saying it's what they bring to the table. Correct? Would you
Correct.
agree?
Yes.
And indeed, someone might bring their expertise, not capital, but their expertise and knowledge, and they might be worth on an annual basis, maybe $450,859 US per year. Would you agree with that?
Yes, if they have the ability, the education and all sorts of other things, yes.
What
I
is
mean, there's a
fair
number
and
of factors, right?
what's that?
I said there's many factors that explain how people, what determines a person's income over, in terms of people's income. That's some of the studies that are done by economists to try to predict earnings relative to factors like education, you know, and other factors.
The point that you're making is that what is appropriate to determine what fair and reasonable receipt of money is depends on what someone brings to the table, right?
Yes, well, I think you mean in terms of what someone as a person brings, what they actually do. I'm not quite sure what you mean by bring to the
Well,
table.
I mean, let's look at you as an example.
No, I just want to make sure I understand your question, so.
Whether it's you as an individual, or whether it's a group of people who jointly own some property, or whether it's a First Nation that brings the resources to the table, an important factor in determining what it is fair for each cohort to get, whether it's individual or collective, is what they bring to the table.
Okay, yes,
And that's why the executive compensation for the chairman of Imperial Oil, for example, might be reasonably $17.34 million US per year, right?
yes, that's correct.
Now, just sticking with Imperial Oil for a moment. Could you go to page 546 of tab 16 of volume 2 of the compendium?
Yes. Which page?
Page 546. This sets out the total assets of Imperial Oil for 2022. Now, you told us you're a director of Imperial Oil, correct?
$546 is the same.
Yeah, bottom of the right-hand page, 546.
Right.
Now, you told us that you're a director of Imperial Oil, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you recognize this document at tab 16, do you not?
Yes, it's 10K report.
So you call it the 10K. What's a 10K?
Oh, it's a submission that goes to the Securities Exchange Commission in the United States.
All right. And if you look at, let's back up and go look at page 510 for a moment. It's the signature page. It's 510 on the right-hand side. It's the compendium page 510.
Yes,
All right. And you see your signature there?
yes,
So you're familiar with this document, the Form 10K?
yes.
And let's go back to page 546. And the total assets of Imperial Oil are a little bit over $43 billion, correct?
That's correct. In,
And-
yes, US dollars.
US dollars. Thank you for the correction.
No,
It's,
it's real dollars.
yeah. Yeah. Now let's go back to page 522. Of the Form 10K. And we have the net income for Imperial Oil in 2022. And do you see that the net income for Imperial Oil in 2022 was $7.132 billion?
Yes, including gains and sales and assets.
And so, you know, is it fair then to say that a 7 billion or a $7 billion return on $43 billion of assets equates to a return of a little over 16% per year.
I think that would be, I didn't do the calculation, but may well be.
Now, the Anishinaabe were deprived of, may well be. Do you want to take a moment to do the math? Because I just want to be clear about this point.
You mean?
Whatever the math shows, you're okay
Well, let me
with
just-
7 divided by 43.
Yeah, it would be about, 13-14%, but it'll be whatever number you said. I won't disagree with that.
I've done the math. It's 16.2%.
Okay, oh,
Look at,
I won't question your ability.
Okay. so in this case, the Anishinaabe were deprived of money over time, over 170 years. Would you at least agree with me that there's no economic reason? I want to stay within the lane of economics. Why the Anishinaabe could also not have earned 16.2% on their capital.
But this is 16.2% for 1 year, which oil prices have been very high. This has not been the average return over time, and nor does it take into account the risks that are, and the cost of risk that would be associated.
Do you know what the average rate of return is?
No, I forget. I mean,
Okay.
I'd have to go back, read, do the calculations. The point is, you just pick 1 year.
So, but I guess the point I'm making, and I wonder if you agree, is that there's no economic reason why the Anishinaabe could not have achieved rates of return that whatever, if it's not 16%, if it's something else, whatever Imperial Oil could get over time, there's no economic reason why the Anishinaabe couldn't have done the same.
Well, first of all, this is an oil business, which is different than mining and forestry, so they're not comparable in terms of rates of return necessarily. In fact, it's kind of well known that oil and gas companies have tended to earn more profits over time compared to mining companies, so
So,
they're not comparable. Secondly, it always depends what decisions people make. So when you're saying they could have made, yes, maybe they could have made, but it all depends on the decisions that they make and the willingness to take on risks.
indeed.
Yep.
Thank you.
And as we know, not everybody does well in the stock market. There are people that do quite badly.
Okay. Did you listen
It
to
could go
Professor?
the other way.
Did you listen to Professor Stiglitz testify about long-term investors?
I remember he made a point about that.
Right. You don't disagree with that, do you?
Yes, no, I don't disagree that you could have long-term investors. That's
Right.
correct.
Thank you. I wonder if we could turn to compendium tab 10, please. Which
Is
is
in the-
going to be in the first volume, exhibit L.1.
This said 10,
Yes, 10. It's your article on potash. You told us in direct about
right?
how you were working for, I think I'm paraphrasing, maybe I'll get it wrong, but maybe you were you working for the potash, the Saskatchewan government?
Oh, that was much earlier.
Oh, that was much earlier.
Back in 1987.
Okay,
So it was, they asked me to come in and look at the potash and the uranium royalty system at that time, which changed quite a bit after 1987.
okay.
So
This
it's
is an
a different-
article that we're looking at tab 10 entitled Fixing Saskatchewan's Potash Royalty Mess. A new approach for economic efficiency and simplicity. It's written by Mr. Chen and Jack Mintz.
Actually, it's a woman, Wanji Chen.
Oh, I thought that was a guy's name. Okay, it's a woman. I apologize. So Ms. Chen and yourself wrote this article. It's a part of this from the University of Calgary SPP Research Papers School of Public Policy.
Correct.
And if you go over to page 182 of the compendium, which is it's hard to tell, it's the 5th page of the article.
I
And
think it's the
on-
6th page. Oh, I see.
it's the 5th page. If you actually,
Sorry, we're on the 5th or the 6th page? Because I have 6 here. If it's 182.
well, part of the problem, I think that's 183. Go,
What's the
part of the
subtitle?
problem is that when the numbers got, I don't know, is that Bates numbering or
Oh, I see. It's 180. 82 is the
If-
5th
if you look
page.
on the
I
bottom,
see.
what-
I got it. I got it.
excuse me, for the purposes of this document, let's use the page numbers on the bottom left-hand side.
Okay.
Because when we automatically put the numbers on for the compendium numbering, they got covered up by the black
Yeah,
strip.
I can see that.
Okay,
Right, so it's on page 5.
okay. In the middle of page 5, under the heading Saskatchewan's potash fiscal regime, our evaluation, is the paragraph, second paragraph, starting with the words in the context of resource industries.
Correct.
Fairness could be assessed in terms of a fair share taken by government. It's always struck me that fair share is an important concept, but
Well,
who
it's
knows?
always- It's used a lot. That's just the way it is.
I didn't think fair share was something, was anything other than a fair share, but in any event. What you and your co-author write, and I want to read it directly, is in principle, the government as owner of the resource should receive 100% of rents. However, to invite private producers to explore, develop, and extract resources, the government must offer a competitive rate of return, which could include rents to attract investors. So that's consistent with your testimony yesterday, I would suggest. Would you agree?
Yes,
But the point is that the goal of government would be, if it could, to capture 100% of the rents.
if they could.
Right.
My testimony was is they can't.
Right, but you didn't, well, sorry, maybe I'll put it this way. Go to compendium tab 14, maybe that'll help answer the question. Now, recently on or about December 13, 2022, you were on LinkedIn, and do you recognize the post that you wrote?
Mhm.
Yes, you
Yes.
do. And this was a post about an article in the Financial Post that you had written.
Well, actually, it's really based on a paper that came out from the School of Public Policy that was, and I forget the exact length. It was a short paper, 5 or 6 pages, where we had, this is based on the work that we've been doing recently internationally, looking at the production and reserves across the world of various countries, particularly with respect to what we might think of as critical mining reserves.
And what you wrote was, and in part, and I quote, "We also need to start questioning the subsidies and tax credits being tossed around for the energy transition. Companies will invest if the economic returns are sufficient. Canada has the most tax competitive regime for mining in the world today. The real problem hurting investment here is not taxation, it's regulation." Do you,
Yes,
is
I
that
did
a
say
true
that.
statement, what you said there?
and I agree with that statement wholeheartedly.
Let's turn to paragraph 24. I want to deal with some conceptual issues. Paragraph 24 of your main report.
By the way, I should mention that that comment is on the current system. You know that.
Okay,
That's
no,
like-
all right, that's fair.
And in fact,
That's a
it's-
correction you're
it's
able to
based on
make.
very
sure.
current work that we've been doing.
All right, I said that that's a correction you're able to make. Thank you.
Sorry, which paragraph?
Paragraph 24. At the end of paragraph 24, the following words appear. They are therefore not unrelated to the rents earned from natural resources. That's a double negative. And what, if you read that double negative, it therefore means that they are therefore related to the rents. Is that what you meant? Or is this a typo?
No, it's not a typo, but it is what it's meant.
Sorry, can I just get that, please?
Yes. So at paragraph 24, what you meant to say when you said they are therefore not unrelated to the rents earned from natural resources was as if you were saying they are related to the natural resources.
That's correct.
And when
Or
we
I,
need
or
to,
I could say those are not incorrect.
right, okay, one joke for you.
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
I understood. I would be in the same boat. So they are related to the rents earned from natural resources. Correct?
Yes,
Sorry, I'm just catching up on 24.
Yeah.
What is they?
That was my next question.
they is in reference to the previous sentence where I laid out. Maybe not, they were related to. Actually, I'm
Is it
beginning to think
user
that is a
fees?
typo. I think it is a typo. Probably it shouldn't have been not. They are therefore unrelated to the rents, because it's in referring to all these fees that are being charged. I thought it was referring to something else. So that
Right,
is a typo,
okay, so let's back up.
right?
I wanted to, I mean, there's just no point in having the judge make a decision on small, on errors.
Right,
And so we want the right evidence to come out.
yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, so what you meant to say is that user, things like harbor fees, driver's license fees are user fees and are not related to rents earned from natural resources.
Because they're a payment for a service that somebody is getting.
Thank you.
Right.
So you're aware. I'm glad we cleared that up. You do agree that Stiglitz and Hutchings don't include any of those amounts?
Yes, and I said, I agree with that.
Okay. Now, you are aware that Ontario government collects fees to cover fire suppression and firefighting activities in Ontario? Are you aware of that?
Yes, well, I believe so, yes. It's not something I particularly looked at.
Okay, but like harbor fees, driver's license fees, the fire tax levy is a user fee charge and it's not a revenue source. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's a fee for the protection services. I guess the question is, the protection services, whether that actually is to enhance the resource that would be available for. That's, to enhance the resource to preserve the resource from fires and things like that.
We're on the revenue side right now.
No, I know that. I know that.
So my question is the fire tax levy, is that like a user fee? Or should that, or is it something that should be added into the calculation of rents.
Oh, I see. I would treat it as a user fee,
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I would treat it
as a user fee.
thank you.
Let's turn to paragraph 34 of your report.
Yep.
At paragraph 34, when you talk about federal net resource revenues, you opine that there's no way to allocate federal expenses because there is not revenue information contained in the federal documents. This is at the very last line of paragraph 34.
Yes, that's correct.
So you and Mr. O'Reilly did not attempt to calculate those federal expenses, is that right?
Yeah, that would be related to Ontario revenues. That's correct.
Would you at least agree with me that if the Crown had kept track of the information that's missing, they would have been able to do the exercise of allocating? Would you agree with that?
Well, they would, yeah, if they had information on, that could be related to the Ontario revenues, the answer would be yes,
And
I guess.
yeah, what would you guess? Or, I mean, it's almost a tautological statement to that if you
Well,
would have had
let
the
me put it this way.
information, you could have.
Probably, it's just, I just, hadn't gone through the exercise to, because we didn't have the data, so we didn't go through the exercise. So I'm agreeing with you. It's just that I'm hedging my agreement because of not having certain information.
But let's work on an assumption that Canada would have had to have gotten the information from Ontario. Can we do that?
Yeah, if Canada got the information from Ontario, then one could potentially do the apportionment.
And Ontario as well could have done the calculation if they kept track. Is that correct?
Yes, if they got that.
At paragraph 92, let's go to paragraph 92. And I want to maybe just give you a moment to compare paragraphs 92, 104, and 115 after I sort of preface my question. My understanding as I read paragraphs 92, 104, and 115 is that you have assumed in your report that Stiglitz and Hutching engage in a counterfactual world in which all resource rents that could have been extracted would have been extracted. Am I in error?
Sorry, what was the first paragraph? And I went back and then I've just lost which paragraph we're talking.
Well, let's just go straight to paragraph 92. You say,
92.
using the economic theory of land and resource rents as a framework, Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings create a hypothetical but-for world in which they estimate the total value of land sold and resources extracted from the territories and assume that the Crown extracted or should have extracted and collected the full value of the economic rents as Crown revenue over the period 1850 to 2019.
I believe, yes, correct.
So your you proceeded on the basis that in their counterfactual world, all resource rents that could have and would have been extracted were extracted.
No, I didn't say would, that they assume that Crown extracted or should have extracted, collected the full value of rents. So it's not saying they did.
Maybe I could try it this way. do you appreciate that Stiglitz and Hutchings only sought to value the resources that were in fact taken out and the lands that were sold, plus lands that
Well,
were given away,
yeah, no, I would agree.
not those that could have or should have been taken out?
I agree that they were trying to, they were, they were attempting to measure the value of resources and, in terms of the rents. But I think they also went one step farther to say that there could have been a way of collecting the rents and having 100% tax rate. And that actually we say on paragraph 115, and we take a quote exactly from them, which actually kind of goes back to a point, Justice, that we talked about yesterday. You asked me about when I looked over the report last night. I forgot about this sentence, but I'll read it to you on paragraph 115. A simpler, more efficient way of collecting rents would have been one where the Crown appropriates the full value of resource rents with taxes on rents and sales of resources or efficient auctions of the right to extract resources, and then recorded an explicit rather than implicit subsidy for hydroelectricity, lower mining taxes, stumpage fees, and land giveaways. In other words, in other words, the government was able to extract the full value of resources. Now, I don't have a problem with the issue of auctions, because as I talked about yesterday, you can get the ex ante rents through auctioning, and so I'm quite comfortable with that. That it's practical for the government to get a certain amount of rents that way, but trying to do it ex post is more difficult in terms of getting the perfect tax to collect the rents. So the statement that, that this is only about the value as opposed to talking about tax policy, was a key point in which we were debating or had concerns about in terms of what Professor Stiglitz's and Mr. Hutchings' analysis, that they were arguing actually for a tax policy of a particular type.
But they're not arguing for a tax policy at this point today.
But they did say this in one, as I just quoted on paragraph 115.
Is it your position in your paper that the resource rents actually in existence between 1850 and 2019, that of those resource rents, the Crown would have only captured a portion of them?
I would, without going through the analysis of whether there was economic rent or not, and the amount of it, I cannot answer that question.
You didn't seek to value the economic rents then, did you?
Correct. Not the way I would want to. In other
I'm
words,
sorry, no, what was the last
well,
answer?
but I was going to say the amount of revenues that were raised may have been more than the actual economic rents. Because
Okay,
without
you-
evaluating the economic.
You haven't done the analysis.
I did not do.
You can't say that.
Yeah, we did not do the analysis,
The analysis of
measuring the economic rent.
at any time, like in any period before.
And this might be a good time for a break.
Okay. Okay, let's take a break then, 15 minutes.
All right.
This will recess for 15 minutes. But when I resume, you may be seated.
Professor Mintz, can we turn to paragraph 9 of your SIR reply, please? In paragraph 9 of your SUR reply, you say we have no quarrel with their economic rent framework as a conceptual means to measure net wealth.
Yes.
And that's referring to the Stiglitz and Hutchins and economic rent valuation approach, right?
Correct.
You then say, however, the criticism in our report point out both the valid practical problems in accurately calculating economic rent. And then you talk about how you don't think they're appropriate. But I want to first start with your comment about you can't accurately calculate economic rents. And would you agree that just because one cannot empirically accurately calculate economic rents is something different and does not mean that someone cannot come up with an estimate or a range within reasonable bounds? Would you agree with that?
I think that for the I think the answer is that one might be able to try to measure a value of economic rent. People have done that. I know that. But of course, there's a difference between doing that sort of thing for some policy analysis at times versus using a concept that actually has real impact in terms of determining, for example, what an annuity augmentation should, in other words, having real impact. Yeah, it's sort of, it's like, when you think of accounting as an example, it's not perfect, and people do measure earnings for companies, and it has real impact in terms of doing that. Same thing with economic rent. You can try to measure it, but it's not easy to do. And if you don't have confidence in the measurement, then maybe there's a different approach that might be better.
Stiglitz and Hutchins obviously had confidence in their approach, right?
I agree that they probably have confidence in their.
And it's fair that you don't have confidence in their approach, correct?
That's correct.
And it's also fair that you didn't come up with a different approach. Is that correct?
That's correct. Try to do it on a year by year basis. We didn't feel that actually it's really, given the difficulty in trying to estimate numbers going back to 1850 using that approach, seemed to me not to be the best approach, or to even start in that direction.
I now want to discuss the reasons you give as to why you say the approach on valuation is neither appropriate nor reasonable. And the first thing that you say at paragraph 10 of your SUR reply is that in all probability, the time path of resource extraction would have been slower. See that there? Yes, you see that there? We would have to answer yes for
Yes,
the
sorry.
record.
Yes.
Would you agree with me that you can't be certain that it would have been slower? But that's just your opinion?
It's not just an opinion. It's the argument that I made previously that it's not possible to have a mechanism, an easy mechanism to try to tax rents in such a way that you won't have some investment in that. And so therefore you would have some impact on development.
But the government could have sold the resources or leased the resources at the very same price that they actually did, and could have made up the difference to either the Anishinaabe or they could have given a subsidy. I mean, the actual resources that came out could still have come out depending on policy, correct?
Well, no, because it depends on the mechanism that you're trying to capture the rents. And as I tried to argue yesterday, that the outside of auctioning, for lease payments at the beginning. Which is a legitimate way of collecting rents that would not have an impact, on investment. The ex post measures of trying to collect rent, have an impact on investment. And I cannot think of an easy way which you can have as a quote that I gave earlier on in paragraph 115 of the report. I cannot think of an easy way that you can just have a tax on rents without impacting our investment.
If the resources were left in the ground, they'd still be there until they're extracted, right?
That's correct.
The value doesn't disappear.
Well, the value depends. The resources are there, but the value itself can
Okay.
change over time.
All right. And indeed, if commodity prices rise, when the resources are eventually taken out, you get a higher price, at least nominally.
Correct. And of course, prices could fall.
Of course, they could. And you don't say what kind of delay there would be. You don't know what kind of delay, whether it's 1 year, 5 years, or 10 years. You don't say.
Delay in. Sorry,
Extracting, you say in all probability, the time path of resource extraction would have been slower, but you don't say how much slower.
no, that's correct. Did not
And you
say
don't
exactly.
know how much slower it would be.
No, we don't know because it depends on the way that you apply the,
And in your report, you
Revenues.
didn't estimate how much
Sorry, I
slower.
didn't get the last answer.
Sorry. It depends on,
it depends on the, how you affect the path of development. Will depend on the type of mechanism used to collect the resource.
and you did not estimate what the time period would be in your report.
Correct.
I want to turn to your slide deck. At slide deck, page 41. Now, you might recall that yesterday, when you gave your direct testimony, you were talking about empirical limits to the value approach. And the first, one of the ones you talked about was risk and expectations.
Correct.
All right. Now. Professors Stiglitz and Hutchings at paragraph 82 of their report, and I'm just going to read it from you. I don't think you have it. It says, for our mining and forestry rent estimates, they, that's referring to you, and I guess your co-author, Mr. O'Reilly, claimed that our methodology for estimating the cost of capital may or may not adequately account for risk. That's what they said. And then they go on to say, our approach approximates the cost of capital using the upper end of the actual realized returns of investors who considered the relevant risks and invested in these firms. Period. Our estimates of the cost of capital are based on the 75th percentile of actual returns realized among profitable companies, and then in brackets, i.e., excluding firms that recorded operating losses in the relevant industries. And that's what they wrote
Okay.
in
And that's-
paragraph
and that's
82.
My understanding is.
Yes, and on your slide deck at 41, you respond to that comment.
Correct.
Now, I noticed that you didn't comment at slide 41 on some of the other things and the other explanations, excuse me. You didn't comment on some of the other explanations that Stiglitz and Hutchings gave at paragraph 82. And I wonder if I can ask you about those. The first thing they said is our approach, and you don't deny this in your at page 41 of your slide deck. And you didn't comment about it in direct, but they say our approach is bolstered by empirical comparisons. Our results are in line with a database of cost of capital estimates maintained by Professor Aswath Damodaran, Damodoran, a leading corporate finance professor at NYU's Stern School of Business, excuse me. Do you know this individual, Professor Aswath?
Not personally.
Do you know of his reputation?
I've heard his name, but I don't know him personally.
Did you read the data sets referenced by Stiglitz and Hutchins before you prepared your reply?
No,
Any reason why you didn't respond to their view that their approach is bolstered by empirical comparisons?
no.
They next say in continuing on paragraph 82, we also note that Professors Bodway and Smart find that the risk premium demanded by investors from Canadian resource companies has historically been lower than that required for other firms, suggesting that perhaps because resource companies are perceived as less risky than other companies in Canada, citing Bodway and Smart present value report at page 75. Did you consider what Professor Bodway and Smart had to say?
Yes, actually, I remember what they wrote.
And in your slide deck at page 41, you don't comment about Bodway and Smart.
No, I didn't.
Are Bodway and Smart, do you agree with them? Are
I
they
haven't-
wrong?
I haven't looked in detail at their thing, although I am a bit surprised about the lower number, because in the work that I've seen is for mining, it's usually above. Now, it may be they looked at all resource firms, including oil and gas. I'm not sure. I don't know about the details of what they did.
You don't have the ability to say that Bodway and Smart are wrong, do you?
I didn't look in detail at their work, so
No.
I can't say.
And so when Stiglitz and Hutchins say that Bodway and Smart the risk premium Bodway and Smart used is consistent with their estimates, you wouldn't disagree that that's a valid response to your concern?
It would be a valid response.
Thank you. Would you also agree, sir, because at paragraph 82, they indicate, Stiglitz and Hutchins do, furthermore, our use of the actual revenues received by the Crown in earlier years when we cannot reliably estimate rents defrays much of the concern, because in those years, we have significantly underestimated the rents. That's what they say. Do you know what percentage they used actual net Crown resource revenues instead of an estimation of rents?
I know they did use net Crown revenues in certain places.
Do you know how much? What percentage?
I don't remember.
If I told you it was 40%, would that maybe ring a bell?
Could be. I just don't remember.
Is their comment that using 40% actual net Crown resource revenues compensates for errors that they may have had, which I don't think they admitted to errors, but if there were errors, that's a form of compensation for the error? Would you agree with that?
Not necessarily. I don't know. I'd have to check all that.
You didn't check.
No. I was simply commenting on the use of the 75th percentile. As well as the issue around inflation account, which was not done.
Well, we're gonna get to that momentarily. Yeah, I apologize to everybody. Ms. Lewis has reminded me that my reference to paragraph 82 was, it should have been to the Stiglitz and Hutchins reply report. I don't think I was clear on that. Is that correct, Ms. Lewis? Thank you. So I want to sort of dive into some of the complaints that you did mention. We've dealt with the ones you didn't deal with, but let's deal with some that you did deal with. So let's start with your slide deck 41. Part of exhibit 31. And in the third bullet, you say this approach has several flaws. See that there? And when you're talking about this approach, you're talking about the approach of using the 75th percentile.
Right.
Thank you. Now, and then there's sub bullets to that. And the first one is, you say that Hutchins and Stiglitz used ex post revenues and costs to estimate rents. And that this may simply reflect risk, not economic rent. That's what you say.
Correct.
Now, I'm going to suggest to you that Hutchins and Stiglitz did not use the data regarding the 75th percentile to estimate rents. They used it to estimate the cost of capital. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but to estimate the rents, you had to subtract the cost of capital, which is based on this measure that they use.
Right. So,
So in principle, they were doing what I would suggest, which is measure cost of capital, but they did it in a way that I wouldn't have done.
all right, but they use the ex post revenues and costs to estimate the cost of capital, not to estimate the rents. The cost of capital is, of course, an input into the rents, and that's what you meant.
Exactly.
Second point. Economists often differ on proper ways to calculate factors such as cost of capital. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Would you agree that there's no one absolute correct answer on how to properly calculate cost of capital? It's a matter of professional opinion.
I would agree.
Thank you. On slide deck, page 41, you argue that in the second sub-bullet, that the average rate of return on capital has no correspondence to the cost of capital. It could be higher or lower. You see that there?
Yes.
Now, I put it to you, sir, that what you've put down there as a concern is by definition true, because in any given data set where there is an average, some will be higher and some will be lower. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. When you say some will be higher or some will be lower, what are you referring to? In
Well,
terms
that's
of
the nature of an average.
No, are you referring to the returns or to the firms? I just want to make sure I understand the question.
I'm referring to the average rate of return.
Well, there was there was a rate of return calculated for each firm. And then an average was taken. So I guess you mean by firm.
Okay.
And I would agree, yes, there are some that are higher and some that are lower.
So is it fair that your comment that about some could be higher and some could be lower does not tell us whether the average cost of capital is a useful tool for estimating purposes?
It's not a useful tool because you're actually almost measuring the returns, which could include economic rent. My comment is really, it's around the 75th percentile. I could have taken 90%.
Maybe I can get to it this way. Do you agree that the cost of capital? Oh, sorry, let me back up. The cost of capital is a relevant consideration for trying to figure out economic rents, right?
I totally agree.
The cost of capital is a function of debt and equity, right?
Totally agree.
To calculate the cost of equity, a standard method is the capital asset pricing model, which expenses the cost of equity as a function of the equity risk premium. Would you agree with that?
A lot of people use the capital asset pricing model, but actually in the literature, there's been a lot of criticism of the capital asset pricing.
So it's something you disagree with, but something other people agree with.
No, it's typical science, right? You have, it's an old method, the capital asset pricing model, and it's used by a number of people, but there's been some developments in theory of risk, like prospect risk, and there's been work done, for example, by Larry Epstein, used to be at the University of Toronto, where he takes a generalized approach to as measuring the risk premium, which is a different methodology. All I'm just saying is that there are differences in approaches that people have used.
Difference in approaches.
Yeah, but CAPM is the most prominent one, the one that's used the most frequently because it's easiest for people to use.
Right, and let's take a look for a moment at exhibit 1-0047, which I gave everybody a copy of this morning.
Yes.
That's a paper written by someone by the name of Lawrence Booth. You know him?
Yes, quite well.
He's going to be testifying later in this case.
Yeah, so you may want to get his opinion on this.
Well, I think I already have his opinion. It's yours. It's yours that I wanted to ask about. If you go over to page 124 of this article,
And have we marked this yet?
and no, it's already a trial exhibit.
Oh, that's right.
It's 1-0047.
Thank you.
And at page 124 of the article, under the heading conclusions.
Mhm.
Second paragraph. He says, in standard finance models such as the CAPM, that's what that's what you just referred to.
Right, capital asset pricing model.
The equity risk premium reflects the price of risk as individuals trade off the higher expected return for the riskier security against its increased risk. And would you agree with me that in using the CAPM model, when economists estimate the equity risk premium, they commonly use averages?
Well, it depends, depends what we're referring to, because there's different expected returns. There's the expected return you get from the stock markets, for example, the dividends and the capital gains that you get from holding the asset. And that's, I'm just saying this is one way of calculating the rate of return, which is what's typical in these CAPM models. That's the rate of return you're calculating. It's not the accounting return. That's a different number, which is based on book accounting.
Yeah,
calculations.
I appreciate that, but
And that's the point that I'm really getting at.
that it's not an accounting effort. I'm sorry, maybe I'm not understanding the point you're getting
So-
at. Maybe
so
I
when
can
you-
ask, the question this way.
Yeah.
Economists estimate equity risk premium by using the CAPM model, correct?
Correct.
Stiglitz and Hutchings did that, correct?
No,
How do you think they did it?
they calculated using, as I understand it, book rates of return. And calculating the 75th percentile and saying that this is the cost of capital.
All right. So would you agree with me that
That is not-
firms,
Yeah, sorry. Okay.
would you agree with me that firms in the 70th percentile is probably they probably have a cost of capital that is higher than the 50th percentile of all firms?
Well, they're using accounting numbers, so I don't know. It's
Okay,
not the same as a CAPM model. That's based on looking just at the stock market returns. You know, the capital gains you get in holding the share and the dividend yield. It's a totally different thing.
all right, perhaps, perhaps we can return to that later. One of the things you mentioned yesterday was something called diversifiable risk. You remember that?
Yes,
Do you agree that, sorry, you talked, I think when you were talking about diversifiable risk, you talked about, I think you gave an example of someone looking for ore in the ground and it might not be valuable enough. Is that ringing a bell?
with geological risk, I was talking.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you say that this risk hasn't been taken into account in estimating the cost of capital by Stiglitz and Hutching?
Well, we have to remember there's really two parts that when you're estimating the present value of a project. There's your cash flows and your expected cash flows, which depends on probabilities. This is where expectations come. And then there's your what people might use as a discount rate, which is often people will use something derived from it's called the weighted average cost of capital, which is typically deriving an equity risk premium that one would add to the cost of equity finance. And then there's a debt interest rate and taking a weighted average of that. So the geological risk comment I was really referring to is with respect to the expected cash flows that you get from the project. If you could weight that into the risk premium, one could also do it that way. There's two different approaches of trying to correct for different types of risks.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had thought yesterday in your direct that you testified that Hutchings and Stiglitz didn't take into account diversifiable risk and that was an error on their part. Did I misunderstand?
Yes.
Okay.
I should also add that diversifiable risk is a very useful concept when you have perfect capital markets. And of course, one of the issues when you're going back in history is whether we had perfect capital markets in the 1800s and the early 1900s. It's a very different kind of world.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we've had the question corrected and
Yeah.
I perhaps we can move on to the next bullet point. The next bullet point is that risk is being measured as financial risk, other risks and expectations, political, regulatory, delay, and other factors are not included. And you say that that's a concern that you have, correct?
Correct.
Now, political, regulatory, delay, and other factors, those risks, they're relevant because they would lead to firms having lower profits. Is that right?
That's correct. Lower cash flows. Correct.
And lower cash flows lead to lower profits.
Correct.
Mr. Hutchings used actual profits of the companies. You're aware of that
For what calculation?
for his calculations of rents.
Calculation of rents or the cost of capital?
Sorry, the cost of capital, excuse me. Thank you.
Yes, he did. But-
So,
But that's a different exercise. Sorry, it's not equivalent to what I'm talking about.
sorry, but you would agree with me, sir, that given that risks are reflected in profits, and that given that Mr. Hutchings used actual profits, I put it to you that Mr. Hutchings included those risks of political, regulatory, and delay and other factors. Would you agree with that?
Well, if you measure, if you take the actual revenues and the actual earnings of the firm, and you're using past data, the question is that a projection of the future? And I would suggest that that's not the case.
Well, who's projecting the future? Hutchings and Stiglitz aren't
Well,
projecting the
you're trying
future.
you're trying to base on a certain point in time what people think the economic rents are going to be in the future.
So that's what you think Stiglitz and Hutchings did a forecast for the future.
Well, you're trying to find okay, let me go back. The measure of economic rents, you're taking the revenues that are being actually earned, so that's fine. And the actual earnings of the firm, and that's fine. But to get the cost of capital, where you adjust not only for the cap in risk premium, but the expectations of the future income that you can get from the project, you can actually correct for risk in two ways. One way, which are equivalent, by the way. One way is to put it into the discount rate, which people don't normally do. They leave that part out. The other way is to put it into the cash flows. And so you might actually reduce the value of the cash flows to take into account uncertainties associated with what those cash flows might be. Those are the earnings that you're referring to, but the past isn't necessarily a guide for the future. And let me give an example. And I'll use my board experience, which has been with Brookfield and not just Imperial, but a number of companies. Companies all do their net present value calculations on whether an investment project is acceptable or not. And they'll use a discount rate just kind of similar to what one would think of for the cap-in model, kind of weighted average. So that would be the cost of capital kind of with financial risk. But in order to tell whether a project is going to be acceptable or not, there's a question of how you estimate your future cash flows. And what a lot of companies may do to try to kind of de-risk that is to maybe take assumptions where it's kind of like stress testing. You try to take the kind of like a pessimistic case of what those cash flows will be. And actually, Professor Stiglitz wrote a wonderful paper many years ago on the concept of certain equivalence. And that is, you can correct cash flows and put it in certain equivalent terms by taking out risk, or you can put it into the discount rate. Either of those are actually equivalent in mathematical terms. But the certainty equivalent way is, I've always sort of appreciated what these companies have done, because by taking a pessimistic view of the world, in other words, pessimistic expectations, they actually de-risk some of those cash flows. And that's what I was referring to. When you look at past earnings, that doesn't include that de-risking process or certainty equivalent process.
All right, that was a very long answer, and my question still isn't answered. A very long answer, and my question still hasn't been answered, so I'm going to ask it again.
Okay.
Do you agree that Mr. Hutchings in his calculations included in the risks of political, regulatory delay and other factors?
No. For the
On
reason-
slide deck 42,
Professor Mintz was, a number of times, I'd like to raise an objection.
What?
A number of times Professor Mintz has been wanting to further expand and say something. I feel like he's been cut off a few times, and I just wanted to make sure he has the opportunity to finish.
Clearly, Professor Mintz, if there's something you want to add, go ahead and add it. I did not mean to cut you off if I did.
No, it's okay. We can go ahead.
Okay.
We'll make sure the witness has room to answer.
Let's talk about page 42 of your slide deck and inflation. You say that Stiglitz and Hutchins do not try to adjust profits for inflation. You are aware, I hope, that Stiglitz and Hutchins use nominal dollars in their calculation of profits. Are you?
Correct.
They used a wait and see approach and took actual nominal dollars into their calculation.
Correct. And they discounted by a nominal, or at least they would call a nominal interest rate or a nominal cost of capital.
Would you agree that by doing their calculation based on a wait and see actual approach in nominal dollars, they didn't have to adjust for inflation because the profits are expressed in actual dollars in the year in which they're earned?
No, that's the point of what I was talking about yesterday. It's still incorrectly measured profits. Because they've not made adjustments for depreciation, inventory costs that are all based on historical prices.
Oh, that's a different issue than inflation.
No, it's very much related to inflation.
So I'm sorry, is your point about inflation, you just answered that your inflation point is about depreciation, depletion, and inventory costs. Is that right?
Point that I'm making is that when you're looking actually at the book profits of a company, they tend to be misstated in terms of taking into account inflation. In other words, if you wanted to adjust it for, they tend to be misreported in a way, especially during periods of high inflation, that could be a problem. And the reason is that depreciation and inventory costs are based on historical prices and not the replacement cost associated with them. And that if you do make the adjustments, you would end up lowering profits.
All right.
And these would be nominal profits.
Right. So your point about inflation is the depreciation, depletion, and inventory costs.
Correct.
Thank you. Let's deal with that then. Let's go to your slide deck, page 10.
Okay.
Now, in the blue box, on the second to the left, second column, first column, second row, firm must invest more to sustain capital due to depreciation, depletion, and amortization. That's what we're talking about here?
Yes.
Now, in your example, you use 10%. See that?
Correct.
And just to remind us all, but that number of 10%, like all the numbers in your examples, are simply made up for illustrative purposes, correct?
That's correct.
Now, in any event, the blue box to the right of the one we just read explains that the company has to go out and raise money to fund those acquisitions to sustain its capital, correct?
Correct.
And sustaining capital is another way of saying you have to replace your capital.
Correct.
Now, when money is spent to sustain or replace capital, the bumped up capital asset shows up on the company's balance sheet on the year in which the purchase is made. Is that right?
That's correct.
The company then has to have
Sorry,
a
excuse
return.
me. I just want to make sure, could we just go back? Could you ask that question again? Because I think there's a slight issue involved with it.
When money is spent to sustain or replace capital, the bumped up capital asset base, I guess, I didn't use that word, but the asset base will show up on the company's balance sheets. That's the first thing.
Okay, what, in terms of the cash flow statements, the new expenditures will show up in the cash flows as a current expenditure. In terms of the actual book accounting, the depreciation that's deducted from income is still based on the historical.
Not for the new asset that's purchased. It has a new.
No, I agree, but the point is that depreciation, when it's calculated year by year for accounting purposes, it's based on the historical prices. Now, you may expand the asset for a new asset, but you're still using historical prices for the other assets. And that's the depreciation.
All right.
Could I just throw in one question?
Mhm.
Not to stop this line, but am I correct in understanding when you say in terms of actual book accounting, the depreciation that's deducted is still based on historical price?
Correct.
And you are describing, if I remember correctly, this term, generally accepted accounting principles?
That's correct.
Okay, so that's what everybody does.
Yes, actually,
Okay,
yeah.
that's, I just
Actually,
wanted to-
just to be a little bit more precise, today, Canadian, although not all companies, they either use general accounting GAAP.
right?
But there's another one, International Finance Reporting System, which actually most Canadian companies now using. That's just a minor.
But
It's
the
all
reason you
same sort of
describe
thing,
that
same thing.
as what people do is because that's what everyone does.
Correct.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Mr. Schachter.
Yes. So you have an original asset that's depreciated based on its original price, but then that it gets depreciated down to zero perhaps, and they buy another asset, a replacement.
Correct.
Or they spend money to sustain it. The depreciation on that new acquisition or money spent on sustaining the old asset gets depreciated at the new cost, not the lower cost.
Correct.
And in doing their analysis, Stiglitz and Hutchings take into account depreciation and depletion because they calculate the rate of the rate of return using not only the existing assets, but the ones that are purchased. You understand that?
That's correct.
So would you agree then that Stiglitz and Hutchings included in a return on the additional capital as part of their cost of capital that they calculated?
On new capital, but it's included with all the other assets that are historical assets. I think this goes back to the question of what do we, on book accounting, what is depreciation? It's money that's put aside to some point in time replace capital. So when I said that it's meant to sustain capital, it's a way of evaluating what that charge should be. And the charge should be if one was using inflation accounting methods, the charge would be to use the replacement costs for the assets that you're buying. And I'm just talking about that in terms of how you're calculating depreciation, because it's based on the service life of assets, and there's still assets that you're still using that are old and still based on the original price, and you're calculating your depreciation based on that.
I'm going to suggest to you that Stiglitz and Hutchings did not have to be concerned with depreciation and depletion or amortization because they took that into account in how they did their analysis. Do you agree with that?
They subtracted it from revenues, yes. But it was the wrong number.
You haven't provided data as to what the right number should be.
No, but I gave you an indication during the periods of high inflation, when people did inflation accounting, that it can matter a lot. And I worry about it particularly during periods of higher inflation. 2% inflation is not as serious as when we're talking about 5 or 6% inflation like we have today.
I wonder if we can maybe turn to spectrum. Let's go to page 38 of your report. Sorry, paragraph 38, page 21, I apologize.
This is the main report.
Yeah, the main report.
Thank you.
Now, at paragraph 38, you opine that spectrum is not bound by geographical limits.
Right.
You continue, but it is sold on a basis of restricting radio frequencies to licensees to maximize the efficient use of spectrum.
Correct.
What you missed from there is that, and I'm going to suggest to you that what is sold is not the spectrum, but what is sold is a spectrum license. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
And the spectrum license is for use of spectrum over a certain geographic area only. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it's correct. Which could be a large area or a small area, but yes,
So when you say spectrum is not bound by geographical limits, you're talking about the science of spectrum.
I'm talking about the electromagnetic waves. that
You're not
go quite
talking,
long distances.
right. So just to sort of make clear that we understand that, can you go to tab 4 of the compendium volume 1? And I just have an excerpt of the Radio Communications Act. And paragraph 5 under minister's powers, starts at the bottom of
Sorry, what page?
page 24 of the compendium.
That's your 24?
Yes, my 24, paragraph 5 of the statute. And it talks about the minister's powers and says, subject to any regulations made under under section 6, the minister may, taking into account all matters that the minister considers relevant for ensuring the orderly establishment or modification of radio stations and the orderly development and efficient operation of radio communications in Canada, issue and Roman numeral I.1 spectrum licenses in respect of the utilization of specified radio frequencies within a defined geographic area. And that you agree with that.
I agree with it.
Okay, that didn't make it into your report.
Well, because it's a regulatory event.
Well,
I was talking about spectrum, whether it was a natural resource.
if you don't have a geographic territory, you've got no no spectrum license to sell. It's spectrum over a geographic area. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, but that becomes a regulation. The government is.
Would
saying
you-
that In
Yeah.
terms of the use of the spectrum.
Would you at least agree with this then? That the spectrum auction revenue is closely related to the use of land?
I would say it's closely related to the regulation of the license. In that case,
Would you agree that the purpose of the auction is to get revenues for the government?
yes,
Do you think it's a fair characterization to say that the revenue from spectrum across geographic territory is similar to a pipeline right of way? Is that a good analogy?
I was, in that analogy that I was making, I was associating it with the terminal, which is a structure that's sitting on land, that's receiving the signals.
Someone wants to send a pipeline through an Indian reserve, they would pay for a right of way. You're familiar with that?
Yes,
If someone wants to send a car through a road and there's a toll booth, they have to pay the toll.
correct.
The car that pays the toll is not owned by the landowner. And yet the landowner pays the toll. Correct? Landowner receives the toll, excuse me. The
Yes,
car driver,
like whoever built the highway, right?
well, yeah, whoever built the highway, whoever's entitled to the toll.
Yeah.
The car comes from
If there's-
outside the area.
Right.
And pays a toll for the use of going across a road.
Correct.
Or through a road or down a road.
Right.
Wouldn't you agree that spectrum licenses, because they're confined to a geographic area, is similar to a toll road or a pipeline right of way?
I would say that the receiver that's built, similar to the example you're giving. The license is more complicated because we're talking about a, a structure that receives the signal and another structure somewhere else that's sending out the signal, which is my example of Marconi. And, where he sent out the signal from Cornwall, England to Newfoundland.
Professor Mintz, you kind of you analogize spectrum to airplanes and the use of air over land.
Yes,
Now, you mooted at paragraph 51. Would property owners have the right to regulate airlines using air above land? That's what you moot.
yes,
You seem to be suggesting that private property owners could not do this. I mean, it's implicit in your question.
that's correct.
I guess it's a rhetorical question,
Yes, it
really.
is a rhetorical question, yes.
And you would get no argument from me about private owners. But would you agree with me that the Crown can and does regulate airlines above Canadian soil?
Yes, the federal government is correct.
And would you agree with me that even though a private property owner doesn't have the ability to charge airlines crossing through the air, the government of Canada could?
That's correct.
And are you aware of the fact that the air law over Canada is governed by convention?
Yes,
And you understand that Canada has in fact in the past charged airplanes who go through its territory, even if they don't land in Canada?
yes, I understand that. In fact, they also collect, well, I know a little less about that as a fact, but I also know that they collect taxes on liquor and things like that when the airplane flies over a province. Actually. They have to collect the provincial tax on liquor,
Mhm.
which is an apportionment formula being used. And there's also an apportionment formula for the corporate income tax.
So does British Columbia get a share of the taxes that of liquor taxes that when a plane flies over?
I don't know, actually. I have to admit, I don't know the answer to that.
But the government collects it.
Yeah, there is a collection tax. But a municipality, I don't think so.
I'm going to suggest to you that similar to an airplane flying through the sky, an airplane that's maybe owned by American Airlines or Pan Am. When it
Pan Am doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, but they're involved in a court case I put in the compendium. that they might have, even though that the plane isn't owned by the government, they flying through the air would have to pay what the Canadian government says they have to pay for the use of traveling through their airspace.
Yes, that's correct.
And I'm going to suggest to you that spectrum licenses are really no different, that someone is paying for the privilege of going through a geographic area, and that's what they're paying for. Would you agree with that? That it's a fair analogy?
No, because just going back to the airplane, we know that there's a charge made by NAVCAN to control airplanes so that they don't crash into each other over the air, right? Because that's what the role of air traffic controllers are. So it's a service, so it's like a user fee in that sense. And there's these other taxes like the corporate income tax that airline companies pay. I know the apportionment formula is based on passenger miles, just a aggregate calculation by province to split up the income for corporate tax purposes by province. And I'm not quite sure how the liquor taxes are exactly portioned, if they're even bothered. To do that.
I'm not debating with you
Yeah.
or trying to challenge you on the issue of whether it's a user fee or not. I'm talking about the ability to charge if it wants to.
Oh, I agree that there's the ability to have a license to restrict the use of spectrum in order to collect revenues. But of course, the licenses are, they could be, as I mentioned, could be in multiple blocks over large different areas of geography, because spectrum itself doesn't belong to geography. The license might do, but not the spectrum itself.
And the license is what people pay for.
Correct.
Thank you. Perhaps we can now move to paragraph 52 of your report. You claim that adding spectrum revenues would be double counting the value of land,
Yes.
but just because there are two streams of revenues that come from within a territory, one could be land and one could be some another revenue source, maybe an income tax, doesn't mean there's double counting. It's two different ways for the Crown to raise revenues, correct?
I would agree with that.
So you can have a stumpage fee, you can have a logging profits tax, and you could have a royalty fee. And that's not double counting, that's just taxing rents in different ways.
I think what I was trying to drive at was going to the terminal issue, where you have a terminal sitting on the land. And the terminal itself is a structure that's on the land, just like any building that's on the land. And the land itself has value. And it's quite appropriate to measure the rent associated with that land, which is being used as part of the process of getting the signal that is based on the terminal itself. So I guess it gets into a question of whether you want to actually include another source of rent, which is associated with the license as opposed to the spectrum itself,
That's right.
which are two different things.
You say they're two different things.
Well, the license, because you don't, in principle, you could have different ways of doing licenses. In fact, that's the latest problem with the new Starlink type technology that I mentioned yesterday, because I actually picked this up having to read something on the Indian Times, where they're now trying to figure out how you could actually price spectrum that's associated with Starlink or that type of telecommunications. And they're still trying to figure that out.
Well,
It's a different process, different type.
speaking of Starlink, are you aware that SpaceX got FCC approval to bid in a $16 billion rural broadband auction in the United States. They're asking for to get some of that spectrum.
Yes,
So in the United States, they've at least figured that out.
again, because you have areas that you have these dishes that are sitting there.
Yeah, but they're paying it to the government.
Yes, correct.
At paragraph 29 of your SIR reply. We should just be clear about this. It seems that you moot that Hutchins does not include airline fees, pipeline tolls, or other infrastructure.
Correct.
Are you suggesting that he should have included it as a shareable resource item?
Uh, Well, we could get into, I think the point is that there was a line being drawn. Between what to include and not include, and payments associated with structures were not being. Or machines are not being included. It's only the payments to land.
But is it fair to say then that your point that you're making is, look at, if spectrum should be included, then so should charges, or sorry, so should revenues from airline fees, pipeline tolls, or other revenues associated with infrastructure. Is that your point?
Yes, but they're not resources.
Well,
say.
but in some instances, they're related to the use of land. You would agree with that.
Yes, that's true, and land picks up the rent because of the use of the structures on the land. Just like the terminal. Expected.
At paragraph 28 of
In the
your
SIR-
SIR
In the
reply.
oh, sorry.
No,
In the
no, if
SIR
you want, I don't want to interrupt you if you gotta,
No, I was just checking if it's a server reply. Yeah, okay,
it is the SIR reply, paragraph 28 of the SIR reply. You note that the regulatory process creates substantial rents not found in other countries.
correct.
So just to be clear, spectrum charges are part of the rents.
Correct.
Thank you. Let's go to logging tax.
Okay.
And this is in, I think if we, a good place to find it is in your SIR reply, your main argument, pages 30 to 32, or your SIR reply, pages 4 to 7. And I want to start off by looking at paragraph There's
You mean just page 7 of the server reply?
pages 4 to 7 of your SIR reply, I believe, deal with logging tax,
No, just page 7
just page 7.
Yeah.
Okay,
in the server reply.
just a moment. Okay. So the first point you make at paragraph 32 is we are not arguing that logging taxes are not a resource revenue.
Sorry, we're.
So
Paragraph.
Paragraph
In the server
32.
reply, correct?
in the SIR reply.
Right, correct.
So the first point you make is, yes, conceptually, you agree that logging taxes are a resource revenue.
Correct. Just like mining profit tax.
Yes. Thank you. Then let's take a look at paragraph 57 of your main report. And this is where you talk about the are they are they subsidies or are they tax rebates? What would you call them that the federal and provincial governments were giving at some point?
Actually, using an economic term, I would call it like a subsidy.
Yes,
Or, but it is, I think you would call it a tax credit, which is probably the word I used.
a tax credit or a subsidy, we can
Right.
use them interchangeably.
I would, no, actually subsidy is somewhat different than a tax credit, because a tax credit. There are two types of tax credits, or refundable tax credits, and then there are ones that are not refundable in the sense that you can only claim it if you're paying taxes.
Right. Would you agree with me that when logging tax was applied, the tax is only on profits from logging?
Yes,
And you would agree with me that the logging tax was a percentage of profits?
yes, or I think there was a limit based on revenues, if I recall, but yes.
The profits
The
only,
principle was on profits.
yes, and the profits only arise if trees are logged. Is that true?
Correct.
Would you agree with me that for some reason Canada made a policy choice to credit the loggers with a tax credit, if I can call it that, equal to a proportion of the logging tax?
Yes, 2/3.
And Ontario made a policy decision to give 1/3 of the logging tax back as a tax credit?
That's correct.
Now, would you have any knowledge as to whether the Anishinaabe were consulted about the decision to give these credits?
I suspect they were not, but I can't say for sure.
Do you have any information that would lead anyone, the court, to conclude that the Crown, in deciding upon giving these credits, whether it adverted to the consequences that that might have to the Anishinaabe? Is there anything that you saw in the record? No?
No.
I'm going to suggest to you that the policy choice to give a tax credit did not, in fact, eliminate the existence of revenues from the logging tax. Would you agree with that?
That would be correct.
And I want to go to page 19, tab 17 of the compendium,
Volume 1.
which is volume 2. And it's an excerpt of a trial exhibit. So it's an excerpt of a 1967 report entitled The Ontario Committee on Taxation, Volume 3, The Provincial Revenue System. Have you read that document? Are you familiar with it?
I have seen it, or at least I, do remember some of it.
See, because I think this document is going to give us some historical background into the issue.
Yes, and
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no,
I
was just
didn't
gonna
ask you a
say,
question, but
when
if
I
you want-
was preparing the part that I did here, I went through a lot of the budgets of the Ontario government talking about the logging tax.
So you, in preparing your report, you didn't have reference to this document.
Correct.
This is part of exhibit 1-5293. And I want to just refer to parts of it. And if you go to page 672 of the compendium, there's a heading under the Logging Tax Act. See that?
Yes.
And at the next page, 673. At item number 44. It says, but the existing tax credit arrangement raises in our minds considerable doubt about the advisability of retaining the logging tax. As a result of intergovernmental negotiation, the Dominion currently allows against federal income taxes otherwise payable a credit of the lesser of 2/3 of the logging taxes paid to Ontario and 1/15 of the logging income earned in Ontario. The province, for its part, allows a credit of 1/3 of the logging tax against Ontario corporation taxes. The result of these two credits is to relieve the logging companies of the burden of the logging tax, except in circumstances set out in the following paragraph, and I don't think we need to worry about that.
I think we agree on that. 'cause
Right.
I said that.
Then at item 46. In principle, additional provincial revenue from logging through such devices as the logging tax and its accompanying credit arrangement is justified only if the province is in fact deriving less than fair economic rent from its system of crown charges. You see that?
Yes.
So what they're opining on is they're saying, you know what, a logging tax is okay in order to try and capture a fair share of the economic rents. You would agree with that? That's what they're saying.
Yes.
And then after not the following sentence, but the sentence following that, the authors go on to say, the present credit system, which absorbs the entire burden of the logging tax on the operator while producing a transfer of funds from the federal and provincial government, is evidently based on this premise. And that premise being that the logging tax is to help capture economic rents, right? That's what it says.
No, I'm not sure what this present, let me read this a little bit. more
Yeah,
carefully,
sure, take
'cause
your time.
My problem is with the word this premise. I'm not sure what this premise actually is referring to.
I'll let you read it and then I'll perhaps direct you to another part of the document that might help you.
Okay, I'll
Okay.
agree with, I think,
Oh, I'm sorry?
I'll agree with what you said.
Thank you. Goes on to say, but if a transfer of federal funds is indeed warranted, we believe that it can preferably be effected as a straightforward payment rather than as the tortuous outcome of arrangements for recouping a tax, which then is in effect not a burden on the operations on which it is levied. We therefore recommend that in the negotiation of general federal provincial fiscal agreements, Ontario offer to repeal the Logging Tax Act in return for an additional share of income taxes imposed upon taxpayers engaged in logging that approximates the present net return to Ontario from the existing logging tax. You see that?
Mhm.
Are you aware whether that happened?
The logging tax was eventually just repealed entirely. Actually, when did this report get written?
1967.
So this was after the logging, the credit was brought in. And the
Before it
logging
was,
tax was eliminated 5 years later. If I recall.
I think it may have been up to 1980. I can't recall myself, but it
No,
was
in
after.
1980s, there were still payments made. It
Oh,
was actually
yes,
repealed in, took like 5-6 years to finish off
yes,
back payments. From the numbers that we had.
yeah.
Um,
From
so
your economic expertise, is that what happened?
It seems to me that I would say that probably that's where they ended up, is just repealing the logging tax altogether
And getting a greater share of income tax.
and getting a greater share.
So what's happened is that something that should have been economic rents is coming back to Ontario in the nature of taxes.
Correct. That's always an issue,
Right.
looking at these things.
Certainly an issue for me.
There's also a point that they raised, which I think is an interesting point, and maybe one of the reasons that drove this was the loss carry forward on the profit tax. If you had losses, or the logging tax, it wasn't carried forward. And those profit losses,
Okay, thank you.
and that may have been one of the drivers.
I think now might be a good time for a break. I am doing very well, actually, and I want to have a good assessment of how much more time I need. I think I might be able to finish today
Okay,
in good time.
very good. All right, we'll take the break.
I'm sorry?
What time is it?
It is
12:25?
now 12:25.
What's your
and-
plan?
What if, how long do, 1:30, 1:45 maybe? 1:45 does that give people
1:45.
enough time?
Fine.
Okay.
All right, we'll return then.
All right. This court will recess until 1:45.